Nobody ever sat you down and taught you what to do when someone cuts you off in traffic, when your boss embarrasses you in a meeting, when someone you love says something that slices right through you. So your brain just borrowed a program probably from your father, your mother, or the first person who modeled strength for you. And you've been running that old borrowed program ever since. Not because you're weak, because nobody showed you the upgrade. Here's what the research on elite performers, hostage negotiators, and the world's most influential people reveals. The ones who never seem rattled, the ones who stay calm when everything around them is on fire. They're not suppressing anything. They're not zen. They're not emotionally unavailable. They have a system, a trained, installed automatic system that intercepts the trigger before it ever becomes a reaction. And today, that system becomes yours. Think about the last time you got angry, really angry. Not the small frustration of a slow driver or a cold cup of coffee, the kind of anger that took over your body, tightened your chest, shortened your breath, and made you say or do something you later regretted. Now ask yourself one honest question. Where did that response come from? Not the situation, not the person in front of you. The response itself, the way your jaw clenched, the way your voice changed, the way your body shifted into a posture your rational mind didn't choose. Where did that come from? The answer is going to make you uncomfortable, and then it's going to set you free. You didn't create that response. You copied it. Somewhere between the ages of 3 and 12, your brain was doing something extraordinary. It was watching, recording, filing away every emotional response it witnessed from the people around you, your parents, your older siblings, your teachers, the neighborhood, the culture you grew up inside. Your brain, at that age, had no filter. It had no critical faculty to evaluate what it was absorbing. It was purely a sponge, and it soaked up everything, including the anger, including the way the adults in your life handled frustration, disrespect, disappointment, and pain. And it filed all of that under one silent label. This is how humans respond when things go wrong. That's the program. And you've been running it ever since. Here is what makes this so powerful and so dangerous at the same time. The program doesn't announce itself. It doesn't tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, I'm about to take over for the next 30 seconds. It fires automatically, beneath your awareness, faster than conscious thought. Neuroscientists call this the amygdala hijack, the moment your emotional brain overrides your rational brain so completely that the thinking part of you essentially goes offline. You don't choose the anger. The program runs and you wake up inside it, already 3 steps in, already saying things, already reacting, already in the aftermath of something your conscious mind never approved. And here is the part that most people never stop to consider. That program was written by someone who was also running a borrowed program. Your father's anger, if that's what you witnessed, wasn't his original creation either. He copied it from his father, who copied it from him, stretching back through generations of people who were never taught anything different, who were never given a better option, who simply passed down the only emotional software they had. You are, in many ways, the latest version of a very old file. A file that has been copied and transferred across decades, across households, across entire bloodlines without a single update. This is not about blame. That part is important. Understanding where the program came from is not an invitation to point fingers at your parents or your past. They gave you what they had. Most of them were doing the absolute best they could with the tools they were given, inside the conditions they were surviving. This is about something far more useful than blame. This is about awareness. Because the moment you see the program, clearly the moment you recognize that your anger is not your identity, not your nature, not some permanent fixture of who you are, but simply a piece of inherited code running in the background of your nervous system, everything changes. You stop defending it. You stop justifying it. You stop saying, that's just how I am, as if it were carved into your bones at birth. Because it wasn't. It was learned. And everything that was learned can be unlearned. Everything that was installed can be uninstalled. Every pattern that was inherited through observation and repetition can be interrupted, examined, and replaced with something you actually chose. Something that serves the life you're trying to build, the relationships you're trying to protect, the person you've decided to become. The anger was never yours to begin with, which means you are not giving anything up when you let it go. You are simply returning something that was never supposed to be yours in the first place. Every single person walking this earth has a list. They may not have written it down. They may not even be consciously aware it exists. but it's there a precise, personalized inventory of situations, words, tones of voice, facial expressions, and behaviors that have the power to reach inside them and pull something raw and reactive to the surface. Someone talks over you in a meeting, and something ignites. Someone dismisses your idea without consideration, and you feel heat rising in your chest. Someone shows up late again, and the frustration that floods your body feels completely justified, completely proportional, completely about them. But it isn't. It never was. The trigger is just the match. The fuel was already there long before they struck it. This is the part of human psychology that almost nobody teaches, and almost everyone misses. We specialize. Enormous amounts of energy managing the external world, avoiding the people who bother us, rehearsing arguments in our heads, building walls, setting traps, constructing entire emotional defense systems, all to protect ourselves from triggers we never took the time to actually examine. We treat the symptom and ignore the wound. And so the wound stays open, invisible, waiting for the next person careless enough to brush against it. Here is what the trigger is actually doing. When something or someone produces a disproportionate emotional reaction in you, when your response is bigger than the situation logically warrants, your nervous system is not responding to what just happened. It is responding to what this moment reminds it of. It is reaching back, sometimes decades, into stored emotional memory and pulling forward an old feeling that never got fully processed, never got fully resolved. The person in front of you is not the source of your pain. They are the echo of it. They are the latest face on a very old story. Think about the things that bother you most persistently. Not minor inconveniences, the real ones. The ones that follow you from relationship to relationship, job to job, situation to situation. The person who never listens. The person who undermines you quietly. The person who takes credit for your work. The person who makes you feel invisible. Ask yourself, when did you first feel this? Not today. Not last year. When was the very first time this specific flavor of pain showed up in your life? Because somewhere in the earliest chapters of your story, this feeling has an origin point. And every trigger since then has been your nervous system trying to get your attention, trying to point you back towards something unfinished. This is why two people can experience the exact same situation and have completely different reactions. One person gets cut off in conversation and barely notices. Another person gets cut off and feels a surge of rage that stays with them for hours. The situation is identical. The trigger is identical. But the internal landscape is completely different. The second person isn't weaker or more emotional. They simply have something in that specific territory that hasn't been resolved. The trigger found a wound the first person doesn't carry in the same way. What bothers you is a map. It is the most accurate, most finesse map of your unresolved interior that you will ever have access to. Every irritation is a signpost. Every recurring anger is a highlighted route on that map pointing directly to a belief, a wound, a need, or a fear that is running your behavior without your permission. The person who loses control when they feel disrespected is telling you everything about their relationship with their own dignity. The person who explodes when they feel ignored is revealing everything about how they learn to experience their own value. The person who cannot tolerate being challenged is showing you exactly where their sense of identity is fragile and unprotected. This is not weakness. This is information. And information in the right hands becomes power. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to triggers without ever asking the one question that could change everything. Not, why did they do that? Not, how could they say that to me? But the deeper, more honest, more courageous question, why did that have the power to reach me? Because the moment you start asking that question seriously, the moment you turn the lens inward instead of outward, you stop being a person who is contro, led by the world around them, and you start becoming a person who understands themselves deeply enough that the world loses its grip. There is a moment that most people never notice because it happens so fast. A fraction of a second. A sliver of time so thin it feels non-existent. It sits between the moment something happens to you and the moment you react to it. Someone says something sharp. Someone does something that cuts against you. Someone behaves in a way that your nervous system immediately flags as a threat, a disrespect, a provocation. And in that razor-thin sliver of time, before the words leave your mouth, before the expression takes over your face, before the emotion floods your body completely, there is a gap, a doorway, a moment of pure, untouched potential where you are still free, where you are still the author, where the story hasn't been written yet. Most people blow straight through that gap without ever knowing it existed. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to become one of the most important psychological thinkers of the 20th century, said something that belongs on the walls of every school, every home, every place where human beings are trying to grow. He said that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. A man who lost everything: his family, his freedom, his physical comfort, his entire world, identified that gap as the last unconquerable territory of the human being. If it could not be taken from him inside a concentration camp, it cannot be taken from you inside a conversation, inside a meeting, inside a difficult relationship, inside any of the ordinary provocations of daily life. The problem is that most people have never been trained to find that gap, let alone use it. Their entire nervous system has been conditioned through years of repetition to move from trigger to reaction in one seamless, automatic motion. Stimulus in, response out, no gap, no choice, no authorship. Just a biological machine running its default programming over and over, producing the same results, damaging the same relationships, creating the same regrets. And the most painful part is that most people know this pattern is costing them something. They feel it after every outburst, every snapped comment, every moment where they became someone they didn't recognize. But knowing it and interrupting it are two completely different skills. The pause is a skill. It is not a personality trait you either have or don't have. It is not something reserved for naturally calm people or spiritual practitioners or those with an unusual gift for self-control. It is a trainable, buildable, installable capacity that lives inside the nervous system and responds to deliberate repetition exactly the way a muscle responds to deliberate training. The people you have met who seem unshakable, who receive bad news without crumbling, who absorb criticism without collapsing, who sit inside conflict without detonating, they are not wired differently than you. They have simply practiced the pause until it became their automatic response. Until the gap became wide enough to live inside, wide enough to think inside, wide enough to choose inside. And here is what happens inside that gap when you learn to find it and use it. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for reasoning, judgment, and decision-making, gets the fraction of a second it needs to come back online. Because during a trigger, during the amygdala hijacking, aka the rational brain doesn't disappear permanently. It just gets temporarily overwhelmed by the speed of the emotional response. The pause slows everything down just enough for your higher thinking to catch up. One breath, one deliberate, conscious breath changes the entire neurological landscape of the moment. It shifts blood flow. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It begins pulling you out of the reactive state and back into the choosing state, back into the choosing state, back into the part of yourself that knows who you are and what you stand for, and how you actually want to handle this. This is why breath is not a soft spiritual suggestion. It is a hard neurological tool. It is the fastest, most accessible lever. You have to interrupt the automatic sequence and insert conscious choice back into the equation. The pause also does something to the other person that is almost impossible to replicate any other way. When you don't react immediately when you receive something provocative and respond with stillness, instead of noise, you change the entire dynamic of the interaction. You become unpredictable in the most powerful sense of the word. People who react automatically are easy to manipulate, easy to destabilize, easy to control. Because anyone who knows your triggers knows your buttons, and anyone who knows your buttons can play you like an instrument. But a person who pauses, a person who receives the provocation and doesn't immediately fire back, that person cannot be played. That person has removed themselves from the game entirely. Power in human interaction has never belonged to the loudest voice or the fastest reaction. It has always, without exception, belonged to the person who could wait one breath longer than everyone else in the room. When someone is rude to you, dismissive of you, aggressive toward you, condescending toward you, the immediate, instinctive, deeply human interpretation is that it is about you, that you did something to deserve it, that they see something in you worth attacking, that their behavior is a direct commentary on your value, your competence, your worth as a person. And so you respond from that place. You defend yourself, or you attack back, or you shut down, or you carry it with you for the rest of the day, replaying the moment, rehearsing what you should have said, letting one person's behavior colonize hours of you, our mental and emotional life. All because of an interpretation that felt completely obvious, but was almost certainly completely wrong. The behavior was never really about you. It was about what they were carrying before they ever encountered you. This is one of the most liberating reframes available to a human being, and it is not a soft, feel-good idea designed to make difficult people more palatable. It is grounded in everything psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral science understand about why people act the way they act. Human behavior, at its core, is not random. Every action a person takes, including the ones that hurt you, confuse you, or provoke you, is driven by an internal state. And that internal state has a history, a context, a set of experiences, wounds, fears, and unmet needs that were accumulating long before you walked into the room. The person who snaps at you in the morning is not reacting to you. They are reacting from inside a nervous system that may have been dysregulated since the moment they woke up, or since the argument they had last night, or since the childhood they spent walking on eggshells in a home that never felt safe. The colleague who undermines you in meetings is not responding to your actual competence. They are operating from a deep, chronic fear of being irrelevant, of being replaced, of being seen as less than a fear that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with a story they have been telling themselves for years. The stranger who is aggressive and impatient is not seeing you clearly at all. They are seeing you through a lens that was cracked long before today, shaped by every disappointment, every betrayal, every moment life failed to meet them where they needed to be met. Hurt people hurt people. This phrase has become so common that most people hear it and move past it without letting it actually land. But stop and sit inside it for a moment. Every person who has ever made you feel small, attacked, dismissed, or invisible was themselves operating from a place of smallness, attack, dismissal, or invisibility. Not as an excuse. Not as a reason to tolerate mistreatment, but as a fact of human psychology that, when genuinely understood, removes the sting from the interaction entirely. Because you cannot be personally wounded by something that was never personally directed at you. You cannot take to heart an arrow that was never actually aimed at your heart. This understanding is not passivity. It is not the same as rolling over, accepting poor treatment, or pretending that harmful behavior doesn't exist. It is something far more sophisticated than that. It is the ability to see the person in front of you more clearly than they are seeing themselves in that moment. It is the ability to look past the behavior to the broken, frightened, overwhelmed human being producing it and to respond from that level of understanding rather than from the surface level of the provocation. This is what the most emotionally intelligent people in the world do consistently. They don't react to the presentation. They respond to the source. And when you develop this capacity, when you genuinely begin to see people's difficult behavior as a symptom of their internal condition, rather than a verdict on your worth something remarkable, happens to your emotional landscape. The things that used to penetrate you stop penetrating. Not because you have built higher walls or thicker armor, but because you have changed the way you interpret incoming information. You have rewired the meaning-making process. SS at the root level. An insult stops being an insult and becomes a confession. Aggression stops being a threat and becomes a distress signal. Dismissiveness stops being a reflection of your value and becomes a window into someone else's pain. You become, in the truest sense of the word, untouchable, not because nothing reaches you, but because what reaches you no longer has the power to define you, diminish you, or pull you out of the person you have chosen to be. There is a particular kind of anger that feels more righteous than any other. More justified, more completely warranted. It is the anger that comes wrapped in the language of fairness, of basic decency, of any reasonable person would agree with me on this. It is the anger that arrives when someone fails to meet a standard you were absolutely certain they understood, absolutely certain they shared, absolutely certain they were as committed to as you were. And the most disorienting part, the part that makes this specific flavor of anger so uniquely painful, is that you never actually had that conversation. You never sat down with this person and laid out the terms. You never asked them if they agreed. You simply asked. Fumed. And the assumption felt so obvious, so natural, so self-evidently correct that it never occurred to you that it needed to be spoken out loud. That assumption is the contract, and they never signed it. Expectations are one of the most invisible and most destructive forces operating inside human relationships. They travel silently below the surface of every interaction, accumulating over time, building entire architectures of should and shouldn't. that exist completely inside one person's mind while the other person walks around completely unaware that any such structure exists. You should know that I need reassurance after a difficult day. You should understand that punctuality means respect to me. You should be able to tell when I'm upset without me having to say it. You should want to show up for me the way I show up for you. None of these expectations were ever voiced. None of them were ever negotiated. None of them were ever confirmed as shared values. They were generated internally, projected outward, and then treated as binding agreements the moment they were violated. And the violation the moment the other person fails to meet the unspoken standard lands with. The full emotional weight of a betrayal, not a misunderstanding. Not a difference in values or communication styles or ways of moving through the world. A betrayal, because somewhere inside the expectation was the belief that if this person truly cared about you, truly respected you, truly valued the relationship, they would automatically know what you needed and automatically provide it. So when they don't, the conclusion your nervous system draws is not, we have a communication gap. The conclusion is, they don't care. And from that conclusion, the anger feels not only justified but necessary, a righteous response to someone who has revealed their true indifference. But the other person is living inside a completely different reality. They are operating according to their own internal map, their own set of values, their own understanding of what relationships require, their own deeply held beliefs about what is normal, what is reasonable, what is kind. And their map was drawn by an entirely different set of experiences, an entirely different family system, an entirely different emotional education than yours. They are not failing to meet your expectations because they don't care. In most cases, they are failing to meet your expectations because they never knew the expectations existed. They cannot honor a contract they were never shown. This is where so much relational anger lives, not in genuine malice, not in deliberate neglect, but in the gap between two people's invisible internal rulebooks that were never compared, never discussed, never reconciled. Two people walking alongside each other, each carrying a different manual for how this is supposed to work, each assuming the other person is reading the same edition, and each feeling repeatedly let down by someone who is simply operating from a different set of instructions. The anger that comes from broken expectations is also uniquely self-reinforcing because it feels so logical from the inside. You experienced a need. The need went unmet. The person who could have met it was right there. Therefore, they chose not to. The reasoning feels airtight, but it contains a fatal flaw at its foundation, the assumption that your need was visible to them, that your standard was known to them, that your internal experience was somehow accessible to someone who lives in a completely separate nervous system, with no direct line to yours. Nobody can read your mind, not the people who love you most, not the people who have known you longest, not the people who are most committed to your well-being. The human mind is not transparent, and the human nervous system does not broadcast its needs automatically to the people around it. Every expectation that lives only inside your head is an expectation that exists in a sealed room that nobody else has been given the key to. And standing outside that sealed room, furious that nobody is responding to what's happening inside it, is one of the most common and most quietly devastating ways that human beings lose years of peace, connection, and genuine intimacy. There is a myth so deeply embedded in the cultural conversation around anger and emotional control that most people have never stopped to question it. It is the idea that managing your emotions means containing them, pushing them down, building an internal wall thick enough and high enough that nothing gets through, that nothing shows, that nothing moves you. The Stoic face, the lockjaw, the person who absorbs everything and reveals nothing. This is what emotional strength looks like in tea. Keep popular imagination a kind of psychological fortress where feelings are imprisoned before they can cause damage, where the goal is to feel less, react less, be moved less. And on the surface, this model appears to work. The person running it looks composed. They look in control. They look like they have mastered something the people around them haven't. But underneath the fortress, the fire is still burning. And a fire that is contained without being redirected doesn't extinguish itself. It finds another way out. Suppression is not mastery. It is postponement dressed up as discipline. Every emotion that gets pushed down without being processed, without being understood, without being given somewhere useful to go, accumulates. It builds pressure the way steam builds pressure inside a sealed container. And the human body, the human nervous system is not designed to hold that pressure indefinitely. It leaks. It erupts. It manifests in the places you least expect and least want, in the sharpness that appears in your voice when you're tired, in the disproportionate reaction to something small after a day of absorbing something large, in the chronic tension that lives in your shoulders and your jaw and your chest, and that no amount of physical treatment fully resolves because the source is not physical. The people who pride themselves most on never showing anger are often the people doing the most internal damage, running the highest internal pressure, living the farthest from the authentic emotional processing their nervous system actually requires. This is the crucial distinction that changes everything. Emotional mastery is not about what you suppress. It is about what you do with the energy before it becomes a reaction. Because emotion, at its most fundamental neurological level, is energy. It is a biochemical event, a surge of specific chemicals, a shift in nervous system activation, a change in blood flow and muscle tension and respiratory rate. It is the body mobilizing resources in response to a perceived threat or challenge. And energy, by its nature, cannot simply be eliminated. It can only be transformed. It can only be moved from one channel into another. The question that emotional mastery asks is not, how do I stop feeling this? But where do I send this so it serves me instead of destroys me? This is what every high performer, every elite athlete, every exceptional leader who has ever been studied under pressure understands intuitively or has learned deliberately. The energy of anger, when it is caught before it becomes a reaction, when it is intercepted in that gap between stimulus and response, is some of the most potent, most focused, most generative energy a human being can access. It sharpens attention. It increases physical capacity. It creates a clarity of purpose that ordinary, comfortable states rarely produce. The difference between the person who destroys a relationship with that energy and the person who builds something extraordinary with it is not the energy itself. It is the channel through which it travels. Redirection is a skill built in layers. The first layer is awareness, learning to recognize the physical signature of your emotional activation before it reaches the point of no return. Every person has a unique sequence of physical signals that precede their reactive state. A tightening somewhere specific, a change in breathing, a shift in temperature, a narrowing of focus. These signals are the body's early warning system, and most people have spent so little time in deliberate self-ob separation that they miss every single one of them until they are already deep inside the reaction, already saying the thing, already doing the damage. The second layer is interruption, using the pause, the breath, the physical pattern break to stop the automatic sequence from completing itself. Not to deny the emotion, not to pretend the energy isn't there, but to create the fraction of a second needed to choose the channel before the energy chooses it for you. The third layer is the redirect itself, a deliberate, practiced movement of that activated energy into a channel that produces something other than destruction.